Can you talk about Joseph and Esther and Daniel, they said. They're great models of standing firm in the face of pressure. I pictured 3 serious, challenging talks about resolute faith and life-risking courage. And I wondered how talks like that would breathe fresh air into your lives in a conference called Oxygen. So I got to work and I began to read the book of Daniel. It's always made me smile a bit. Pretentious kings and satraps and weird animal visions and happy ending stories like Daniel in the den of lions. I found writers who said the book of Daniel is kind of a satire. The book of Esther. It always brings a smile that fortunes turn so fast and we get to see the victory of the underdog. The book of Esther makes Jewish people cook pastries and wear funny masks. And I found scholars who said the book of Esther has a carnival style of writing. It's a carnivalesque. And Joseph? Well, it's a gut-wrenching story, isn't it? A father who plays favourites, jealous and scheming brothers, a hero who is thrown into a pit, sold into a slave, the subject of a fraudulent death claim, sexually harassed in the workplace, falsely accused, imprisoned though innocent. And yet, the story of Joseph is a happy one, happy enough to become a technicoloured boppy musical, happy enough to make a fitting end to the book of Genesis, giving us hope after the story of Cain and Abel that brothers don't have to kill each other, and the human task of gardening the earth might actually turn out okay. I found critics who said the story of Joseph is like a little novel or even a romantic comedy. Comedy, carnival, satire. Is that what you're expecting around the topic of standing firm in the face of pressure? Could it be that these books about God's people being far from home are designed to make us smile and even laugh? When Mark Twain thought about the struggle that we can have against human power and pretension, he commented, "The human race has really only one effective weapon, and that is laughter." Can you talk about Joseph and Esther and Daniel, they said. They're great models of standing firm in the face of pressure. I pictured 3 serious, challenging talks about resolute faith and life-risking courage. Then I began to read. Joseph's fortunes turn on dreams. So did Daniel's. And I was reminded that there's a Greek version of the book of Esther that also begins with a dream. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. So these books about the horrible treatment of godly and innocent people are books that value laughter, and each in their own way has something to say about dreams. I found myself ruminating over Psalm 126. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Dreams and laughter are what come to mind when you get home from exile. But dreams and laughter are not only the prerogative of those who have returned. These exilic type figures, Joseph, Esther, and Daniel, are also figures of dreams and laughter. So I want you to leave Oxygen as a dreamer who smiles. That's my ministry statement for the week. I want you to leave Oxygen as a dreamer who smiles. I want you to be one who finds themselves in a story that might even make you laugh. Well, today it's the Joseph story. We're going to get there. But do you remember when you learned about exegesis? It's something that you still do each week, I guess, as you write studies and as you prepare talks. You work hard to expose what the text is saying. Well, do you remember that little dimension of exegesis that you sort of didn't pay much attention to called genre? Well, that's my kind of exegetical key for this week, genre. I've never done this before. I want to highlight a little element in exegesis that we rarely pay much attention to. Because when the Bible writers, inspired by God's Holy Spirit, reflected on how to be faithful when you're far away from home, they came up with a romantic comedy, a carnivalesque, and a satire. What the biblical authors are modelling for us is that there can be a paradoxical disconnect between content and form. The content can be sad and difficult, and you can frame it in a humorous form, as though to say, we can walk by faith and not by sight. Faith can give us access to dreams and laughter even when all our eyes can see is trouble. We are half human and half story. So we need to craft the storytelling of our lives so that we dream and so that we laugh, even when we're far from home. So let's dig down into this Joseph story as a comedy driven by dreams. I think the writer of Genesis thinks that such a way of thinking will actually help us stand firm in the face of pressure. Genesis 37, verse 1. Verse 2. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks. It's unusual, isn't it, for a Bible writer to give us somebody's age at the beginning of a story. Why do that? Maybe it's to signal that this is an exciting time when somebody's moving from boyhood to manhood. It might also make us wonder about how impetuous 17-year-olds can be as he pretentiously tells the dreams to his fathers and to his brothers about how one day they're going to bow down before him. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. 37:9. I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. The brothers are incredulous and quite offended. Is this dream about the future, or is it just some present delusion that Joseph has? And we as readers wonder, where is this story going to go? It's a fascinating way of telling a story, isn't it? To have one of the characters predict the ending as soon as the story begins. It's strange to think that the future can be brought into the present because of some images that crossed through somebody's consciousness while they were asleep. Now, I think we need to do more theological work on dreams. I'm personally very interested in the theological idea of wisdom, and I can see a connection. I mean, biblical characters who are wise, like Joseph and Daniel, are also caught up in the issue of dreams. And we live in the age of the Spirit. Sons and daughters will prophesy. Young men will see visions. Old men will dream dreams. And of course, God has not lost his ability to create truth-telling imagery in the consciousness of human beings. So I wonder, is he using dreams today? In the Joseph story, of course, dreams bring the future into the present. And at the beginning of the story, Joseph's dream anticipates something that's going to take decades to come true. Later in prison, Joseph will interpret the dreams of a baker and a butler and show them events 3 days in advance. Pharaoh's vision while he wore pajamas was, of course, a long-range forecast for his farmers and allowed Joseph to accurately predict 14 years ahead. Now, I don't know exactly how God occupies or experiences time, but it seems fair to say he's not living with the same limitation that means that we experience the past, the present, and the future consecutively. God, it seems, can occupy the past and the present and the future simultaneously. And from time to time, he shares what he knows. Does he still use dreams to do it? I was talking with a man from Sierra Leone the other day. He had a dream where a figure in that dream said to him, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He was a Muslim at the time, but the next day he walked into a shop and there was a pile of Gideon's Bibles had just been put there. And his life with Jesus began. I thought, I guess the dreams have stopped now that you've come to Jesus. He said, no. He still gets insights into what's going on in people's health or what's going to happen in business situations that he's in. Even in our church in Anglo-Saxon Springwood, a man came to church one day because he woke one morning with a hymn in his head. And he said, I felt like I needed more God. Of course, God has brought the future into the present, whether we have dreams or not. Because in the past, Jesus rose from the dead. And that was a demonstration and commitment saying that all who are connected to Jesus will also have that future. We will beat death and enter everlasting life. Our connection to Jesus is like a dream. It means that we transcend time. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Technically, no. And yet, we have been crucified with Christ. And for Paul, of course, things in the future are certain enough to express in the past. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. How's that for a magnificent and sustaining dream, better than sheaves and stars and fat and skinny cows? Perhaps the writer of Genesis is training us to walk by faith and not by sight, to walk with the future impacting our present, to trust in the promises and purposes of God to bring the future into our present. But let's get back to Joseph. It's not long before the one in the fancy clothes with the dreams of greatness is sold off as a slave. And it's not long before the foolish, favourite playing father is made a fool of. Jacob freezes over in grief around Joseph's alleged death. And now being 17 is sad, isn't it? For the living Joseph, opportunity in one so young has been robbed. For Jacob, who believes him to be dead, 17, on the edge of manhood, how sad. What a tragedy to be robbed of life itself. Now, the narrator uses the language of time to alert us to the sad descent of Joseph's fortunes. It's the nature of comedies, of course. that they dip in the middle. Take a look with me at 39, verse 10, Genesis 39, verse 10, and notice how the narrator is referencing time. Potiphar's wife, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. There's difficulty for Joseph, the difficulty of sin and temptation and pressure, day after day. Do you experience time like that? It's rare, isn't it, that we can point to the calendar and say, on the 18th of October, I used to have lustful thoughts, but as of the 19th of October, I just didn't have them anymore. It's more likely that sin in your life is day after day, day after day of lust, day after day of envy, day after day of a stale sense of disappointment that can come into your life. Certainly Mrs. Potiphar experiences Joseph's handsome presence as a day after day after day desire, and so she creates for Joseph a haunting and difficult season, which is followed by unfair dismissal and a miscarriage of justice. Can you relate to that? Being a church worker makes you a public figure, and it makes you vulnerable in the area of reputation, fairness, and justice, I think. People are going to talk about you without necessarily knowing the whole truth about you. Just like Potiphar is going to come to a decision about Joseph without knowing the full truth. Think about what happens when there's a falling out in a church staff team. No one wants to say too much in public. That's good. It's important not to gossip and to care for one another. It's important not to betray confidence. But it means then that you as a gospel worker will have to endure knowing the thought that people are passing on a story about you that is distorted, uneven, and possibly cruel. You'll become that not quite named person in your denominational offices, in those whispered conversations and in those unfinished sentences that your colleagues have. And all along you may not have done anything wrong. And when you're in ministry, you know stuff about people that you're not free to share publicly. So there's going to be contexts where people are going to misread what you're doing because they don't know that you know something else that's affecting your behaviour. You can't put your case. You can't tell the whole story. You can't clear your name. And it wears you down, doesn't it? In ministry, you surrender the power to defend yourself. As a young slave in Egypt, Joseph probably never even had the power in the first place. Well, how did all this affect Joseph? Hebrew writers, of course, don't psychologize much, but Genesis 41:1 has an interesting comment on the unfair imprisonment, again, using references to time. Genesis 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. When 2 full years had passed. The language is literally when 2 years of days had passed. And it's not that common a phrase. When 2 years of days had passed. You can see what the narrator's doing. Joseph felt every single day of those years in prison, like you will feel every insult and critical comment that people make about you. But did you see? This sad, slow-moving comment is only part of a sentence that ends with a plot-turning report. Pharaoh had a dream, And of course, during the prison years, the narrator has already commented that the warden put Joseph in charge. The Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Can you hear what the writer is starting to do here? Crafting the elements to tell a romantic comedy. You need something to go wrong. You need time. But you also have to take things to happy endings. Well, happily, even in an unfair prison stint, the Lord is with Joseph. The driving dream of Joseph being an honoured leader is finding expression even in prison. And then finally, Joseph's God-given skill and reputation bring him to Pharaoh's attention. Take a look at 41:46 for another reference to time. 41:46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh. The narrator's using the notion of time, I think, to make us sad and happy all at once. Oh, how sad. He started at 17, he's 30. That's 13 years of injustice that he's been living through. But he's 30. Isn't that just the right sort of age to take on responsibility, to make a difference? Isn't it the age to step into your vocation? Maybe it's a hopeful moment as well. Joseph is entering into his vocation, not unlike Adam in the Garden of Eden, caring for fruit and gardening and food. He's stepping into his vocation, not unlike Abraham, chosen to be a source of blessing for the world. The narrator then speeds time up. It's probably to communicate happy accomplishment. Joseph gets to work really fast and famine-proofs Egypt. But then the narrative slows right down again as Joseph and his brothers meet up in Egypt. I always find Genesis 42, 43, 44 and 45 a bit confusing. There's all these trips backwards and forwards and you sort of forget what trip you're up to. And the way the storytelling is done is that characters live through events and then they recall the events so that you hear about the events twice. I mean, the Technicolor Dreamcoat just had a couple of little songs here, a bit of a calypso and a Benjamin's as innocent as coconuts, and suddenly it's all resolved. But Genesis 42, 43, 44, 45 really has suspense-building signs of slowness. In 42:17, Joseph puts the brothers in custody for 3 days. Simeon is then held when the rest return home. Joseph is giving them an opportunity to prove that they really do have another brother. Now, you would think that they would quickly grab Benjamin, hurry back for Simeon, but Jacob cannot stomach it. Cleverly, the narrator lets us experience how grief has affected Jacob. Back in chapter 37, when he thought Joseph was dead, he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." And now Jacob's mournful inertia is costly to the brothers. It keeps Simeon captive. It means they run out of food again. It means that Reuben and Judah have to try to coax Jacob to let Benjamin go. And Judah makes a comment that he is finding the plot too slow for his liking. Have a look at 43, verse 10. As it is, he says, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice. Frozen Jacob thaws a tiny amount, and the brothers and Benjamin go to Egypt, but it's still very slow and drawn out. There's a meal where Joseph seats the brothers in order of their ages. There's more tricky hiding things in sacks. There's days of wondering what's going on. How do you understand the slow, teasing strategy of Joseph here? Joseph has been criticised in some commentaries for his use of deception, for making false accusations, for not stopping the charade when the brothers do admit guilt, for holding Simeon without cause. And anyway, once he had authority in Egypt, why on earth didn't he send a message home and say that he was okay? But then again, the writer of Genesis seems to have established that Joseph is a man of integrity and skill. So it seems right that we look for wisdom in his dealings with his brothers. The drawn-out process creates opportunity for the brothers to reveal, perhaps even discover, things about themselves. By casting doubt on the story about there being a Jacob and a Benjamin, by accusing his brothers of wrongdoing, Joseph gives them a chance to show themselves to be honest and responsible. By insisting that Benjamin come to Egypt, Joseph indirectly, maybe even unknowingly, invites Jacob to begin to undo his fascination with favourites. And it means that the brothers can show Joseph whether they have resentment toward the new favourite Benjamin. Joseph falsely accuses Benjamin of theft, and the brothers don't just dump him. Joseph sees them advocate for the innocent Benjamin. Joseph sees their genuine care for their heartbroken father, and he sees a new sacrificial side to Judah. Judah steps into the story, an innocent one, willing to suffer in a substitutionary way. Sometimes I think the end of the book of Genesis is as much the story of Judah as it is the story of Joseph. Now, these relational, psychological, spiritual gains may not have been achieved had Joseph just blurted out who he was. In a theology of how to live in exile, one writer has said is that a favourite biblical image of the person in exile is that they become a wisdom warrior. It's a title that suits Joseph. It's a title that suits Esther. It's a title that suits Daniel. And maybe it can become a title that suits you in these exilic times. A wisdom warrior. There's an aroma of wisdom in the way Joseph conducts himself, like he knows that there's a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, that a person finds joy in giving an apt reply, and how good is a timely word, or like apples of gold in settings of silver is a ruling rightly given. It's hard not to imagine that these very skills of wisdom and speech and crafting of one's life were what helped things to go so well in Potiphar's house, in prison, and in the service of Pharaoh. I think church work is very often like what Joseph is doing in these slow chapters at the end. The delicate and slow work of calling forth growth in character. The shepherding of people toward relationships of integrity and love. And when I say slow and delicate, I mean exactly that. You know that, don't you? And it will be emotionally tough. Remember how Joseph experienced this slow calling forth of character in his brothers? Chapter 42, Joseph turned away from them and began to weep. Chapter 43, their second visit, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He even needs a private room to cry. He needs to wash his face before he can reappear. It makes me wonder why Joseph would bother to put himself through all that. If this were a Shakespearean tragedy, he would just run a sword through his brothers and Genesis would end with 11 dead bodies on the stage. But Joseph knows that he is in a comedy. And so he works with his brothers, even to the point of crying. That's how much he believes that he's in a comedy. Do you know that? What do you experience? Tears or laughter after a long, hard Sunday? What do you experience? Tears or laughter after a tense elders meeting? After that Bible study group that you're leading, which somehow ends in a bitter feud between the members? I wonder if you can do tears and laughter because you know you're in a comedy. Are you at a point in your relationships with people that you're ministering with that you can give yourself to the pain of tears because you know there's a happy ending coming? Joseph is the man who had the future brought into the present in dreams. He's the man who used dreams to plan and to wisely navigate a nation through a 7-year famine. He sees dreams come true, he sees happy endings, and so he dreams and hopes even for his brothers. There's something godlike. It's funny that Joseph says, "Am I in the place of God?" Well, no, but my goodness, you're acting in a very godly way. He hopes even for his brothers, and he can move toward even them with kindness as the story ends. Sometimes our staff at church sit around and talk about all the crazy things that are going on in people's lives and in the weirdness of church relationships, and it feels utterly unfathomable, unsolvable, exhausting. And there's a member of our team who occasionally says, "Well, it's okay. We know the ending of the story." It keeps on being worth dreaming and hoping because we know Jesus moved from death to resurrection to glory. We know where the story is going. Paul says he has hope, and so he can be very bold. He says, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." He says, "We all with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory because we are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." The writer of Genesis is a genius at the happy ending. Look what happens to frozen, grieving, lethargic Jacob. In 45:26, it says he's stunned. He gets the good news, and frozen, grieving, lethargic Jacob is actually stunned. He gets his head around the story, and Jacob revives. In chapter 46, verse 29, we read that Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen and to meet his father. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. The story has been so slow, but now we've got a fast-moving chariot and we've got immediate actions as soon as Joseph appeared before him. And these happy endings are expressed on a wider stage as well. Consider Joseph's words to his brothers, chapter 45, verse 5. Chapter 45, verse 5. "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Down in verse 7, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." It's such theological language, isn't it? And notice Joseph the dreamer, the one who's got used to bringing the future into the present. He says God had intentions. That means God knew the future and had a future, and it expressed itself in the present. It means that God writes happy endings So there's freedom for us in the present to rest in the happy ending that's coming. So Joseph and you can give up on resentment. The brothers and you can give up on distressing guilt. Paul read to us from Genesis 50. The brothers are scared when their father dies that Joseph will now exact revenge. They throw themselves on the ground, they declare themselves slaves, and Joseph's dream comes true again. But Joseph reminds them of the God of happy endings. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Intentions, they're a bit like dreams. They take something from the future and they shape our actions in the present. And when you appreciate God's good intentions for the future, your present can be deeply shaped by that. I'm sure you can hear Joseph's remarkable gospel anticipations in his happy ending summaries. God is a saviour. God will turn twisted stories of sin and betrayal and still make a story that has characters who are wise and characters who are sacrificial, and salvation will be brought to many. Well, let's just end this morning by doing some storytelling observations about this romantic comedy. If you cropped the story of Joseph at the wrong bit, the story would be a tragedy. We need the whole of it to make us laugh. It makes me wonder about the kind of storytelling that we're doing in church at the moment. Our current experience is that the church is no longer at home in Australia. In my denomination, it's like we're watching ourselves become more and more marginal to the lives of Australians under 55. I dare not look at too many graphs and statistics because they make me think that every Presbyterian minister is going to be unemployed 10 years from now. And yet, a Presbyterian friend of mine who's 80 talks about how good things are for the church. She says, the nominalism of the 1950s is gone. Young people, they're so creative. I'm so excited. And of course, most of our storytelling scans across a few decades. But what if we widen the view? How many Christians were there in Australia in 1000 AD? How many people were walking with the Lord in Australia in 2000 BC? How many now? Or what if we don't make the story about the Australian church but the Southern Hemisphere church? Well, then the statistics are completely different. Now, not for a moment am I saying we should stop paying attention to our particular decade and our particular place, nor am I advocating passive, pious inaction. Joseph worked hard for Potiphar and in prison and for Pharaoh. That's what mature humanity does. But we need to inhabit our decade and our time in such a way that we don't tell sad, declining, hopeless stories to each other all the time. We're in a comedy. And comedy is tragedy plus time. It's become a cliche, but it's a good one. What does ministry feel like for you? Tragedy, where you have no time? Tragedy, where you're in really bad times? Tragedy, where you've forgotten how to smile? Here's a story to tell yourself. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. When we serve a Lord like that, then dreams can come true and our mouths can be filled with laughter.